Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and we are in for a treat today because we have true double trouble today. Roxanne Petraeus and Susan Divers, two of my favorite people in compliance. They have paired up, and we're going to talk about Ethena, and we're
Yeah.
going to take a deep dive into the 2024 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. I know I've been talking about this a lot. I've been blogging about this a lot. I've blogged with Matt about this. I've blogged with Christy about this. But these ladies have some very different and unique views on this. So I can't wait to explore that with you guys. Roxanne, I'm going to start with you and just ask you to reintroduce yourself to the audience and
Yeah,
Athenia.
would love to. So I'm Roxanne Petraeus, the co-founder and CEO of Ethena. And my background, what motivated me to start the company is I was an Army officer, duty Army officer for a bunch of years. And just candidly took a lot of really bad compliance training. I think some of the compliance training that the DOJ guidance is saying does not really meet muster. And it never really made sense to me. I didn't understand why we were doing something that clearly wasn't effective. So just logged it in the back of my brain, did a couple other things, and then found myself at McKinsey doing a similar version of what felt kind of check the box training. And it felt, man, even here, this feels very rote. And got excited about the idea of how could you make this so much more employee centric, so much more focused on out instead of just inputs, and started the company.
And for those of you who don't know who Susan Divers is, shame on you. But what you may not know is you will note she is not with LRN. She's with Roxanne at Ethena. So, Susan, could you tell us about your short journey over to Ethena?
Gee, Tom, I'd be delighted. And it's so nice to see you again and do the podcast. As I left LRN last March, and I'd always been intrigued by Athena. I had seen some of their training and I'd heard about them in the marketplace. And then my friend Tim Erblich at Corepedia suggested that I talk to Roxanne. And it was such a good fit that I broke my pledge to take 6 months off. What can I say? So here I am. And it's wonderful. I'm just delighted to be part of Roxanne's team.
I'm really glad you went over there. I was a little perturbed that you didn't take the 6 months, but it seems to be a great fit. Now that we've got the introductions out of the way, you guys really have a unique take on this, the 2024 update. So I'd really like to take a deep dive into it. And I have to start with your belief that the emphasis is over outputs over inputs. So can I start by asking, what does that mean? And Roxanne, perhaps I could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, and I don't want to say like I foresaw this or anything, but it just makes such intuitive sense to me that the idea is they're emphasizing a compliance program that works in practice. Yeah, of course it should work in practice. What is it doing if it's just on paper? Like, how could that possibly be what the DOJ is looking for? And so I think a lot about things like whether it's a code of conduct, a hotline, or training. Like the intended audience isn't the ethics and compliance team, right? That's like a small part of the organization that has really gotten the memo. They've literally written the memo. The audience, the like place that you're going to have impact is the rest of the organization. That junior salesperson who maybe is like fresh out of college, but someone in the engineering org who doesn't think all day, every day about anti-bribery. And so I think the idea as a non-lawyer, non-compliance person reading this is that the program needs to be tailored to each individual at the org such that they can understand it and action it. If it is just kind of written correctly, but almost gate kept somewhere like on an ivory tower, there's no possible way that could have the intended outcome of like producing an ethical culture. Like it just doesn't work if the people for whom need to read and understand and digest this can't even get to it.
So, Susan, you and I have done a fair amount of work together over the years, and I've tried to emphasize process. But I think with this phrase, outputs over inputs, you guys have taken this actually to another level. Could maybe I get your thoughts on that phrase and what all of that means in the context of the 2024 ECCP?
Sure, Tom. And these discussions do go back a long time. I know you were one of the early champions saying checklist compliance is a waste of time. And that's what Roxanne was just saying, too. It's almost cynical. It's sort of let's put a bunch of policies out here that are so complex and so legally dense that the average employee just reads the first paragraph and then goes and does something else. And even as a lawyer, some of the policies I've seen in my career are just, I have to do Venn diagrams to figure them out. So we went from that to saying you have to have a program that isn't just on paper. You have to mean it. You have to have a culture. And in the sort of evolution of the guidance has made that clear. But now, in our view, they're taking it to another level. They're saying, we don't really care about your inputs that much. I mean, it's pretty standard now that you have policies, hotline, code of conduct. What we care is what is the output of those processes. And that's a theme. I mean, I can read you some really interesting quotes from the guidance that I really haven't seen other people pick up on as much as we have. And one of them is that it says, sort of summing up, prosecutors, in short, should examine whether the compliance program is being disseminated to and understood by employees in practice in order to decide whether the compliance program is truly effective. And that's it in a nutshell. And it's there throughout the guidance. I mean, I can talk about that a little later in the comments about training, in the comments about the hotline, in the comments about policies. It's not enough to have the policy and the process. You have to really look at what impact is that having, and do people actually find it accessible and understandable? And is it having any measurable results?
Roxanne, you said something in the first podcast I did with you that struck me then, has stuck with me since that time, and frankly, I use it a lot. And it was along the lines of, if you have bad, crummy, or useless training, and you put
Mhm.
that out, in your case, it was to enlisted men, it communicates, number one, the quality of the training, but equally importantly, it communicates this can't be important because they gave me such crappy training. And
Yeah.
rather than tone at the top, you use that example. And I've used that since that time. What I
Yeah.
saw and heard in your remarks and what I've read, your guys' thoughts on this, that the DOJ really seems to have embraced that. And they understand it's not just tone set by senior execs, it's tone set by everything that you do for your employees. Did I get that right?
I think so. Perhaps the DOJ listens to your podcast. Maybe that's why.
They listen to you.
Dare to dream. But yeah, I think about this so much, like two anecdotes. So one, when I was in the army, they had, and hopefully it's been modernized, but their version of a hotline. And as it was explained to me, there was like a box somewhere on post where you could go and write a complaint and put it into the box. And as an officer, I just thought, oh, that's not supposed to be used. Because if it's supposed to be used, it would be easily accessible. Like it wouldn't be like I do have to walk in public in the light of day to go put a little thing in. So I think that employees are so perceptive to how something is kind of designed and rolled out. Um, I was just working with one of our clients, really design centric organization. And so Athena does, among other things, clients training, and you customize it. And they put so much thought into making sure it started with messages from leadership, making sure it looked and felt very like them. And we were going back over the feedback after, I think, 3 months or so of the training being rolled out. And it was so positive. And a lot of the feedback was like, this really looked and felt like it was made for us. Like it put so much thought, care into it. And I think employees just, I mean, it's sort of obvious, but I think they really notice these things. They notice if this is kind of a big deal to the organization, it's been properly resourced and senior leadership is coming and everyone's paying attention, or if it's something that, hey, here's a dusty PowerPoint, hope you enjoy, don't care if you don't. Like that, I think that we just have to remember that like employees are really smart people.
Susan, the emphasis on employees, or I'm going to say customers of the compliance function, because
Mhm.
I try to communicate to compliance professionals that they have customers, they just happen to be in-house employees. Why is, and if Carsten Tams was here, he'd say, of course, Tom, it's all about the user experience. So how does the user experience, how does the customer, how does the employee centric nature of what you see in the EECCP of 2024 really, is it a shift in the DOJ thinking, or is it
I would say it's an evolution, Tom, and I think it's driven by what they see. when people come in because they've had problems and bring their lawyers and have to explain that their compliance program really is very good. And I think it's part of a broader shift that I started tracking around 2020, where companies and really good E&C programs started saying, okay, we've been a little too focused on output here. We've got this policy on AI or on FCPA, and we haven't really focused on the employee experience. Or in the training area where I really saw this, you have courses that threw 45 minutes of complex information at someone. And even with 2 law degrees, that's hard for me. And if you're a non-English speaker or someone that has been pulled off the factory floor, it's cynical, I think, in some ways. It's saying we can say we've trained you, or we can say you've read this policy, and so really good programs started to say, okay, the focus has to be on the employee experience here, not on pushing content or the output. It has to be, or the input, it has to be on the output. So I think DOJ is kind of catching up, if you want my own opinion.
So, Roxanne, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that I originally interviewed you after you'd come
Mhm.
into the compliance space, and I often tell people that much of the innovation in compliance comes from outsiders. 1, they're not lawyers, but 2, they look at things very differently than I do, or perhaps like Susan does because of our academic training and our early professional backgrounds. Um, Particularly in the product space and compliance, you come to this with a very different set of eyes because of your professional experience. And so I really wanted to with that background, ask what have you seen in the compliance realm that has really evolved since the time you've been in this space outside of the Army? And where do you think we might be headed down the road?
Yeah, I think that we had two fresh sets of eyes. In my experience, you mentioned Army. So I think a lot about leadership, about organizational culture, like how you build really good units that are cohesive and ethical and like mission oriented. And I think that perspective really led to what Susan was saying, which is a real emphasis on employee experience because like leadership, it's all going to sound like very corny posters, but I think it's true. Like it's really about like the followers, how you can't be a great leader by just designating yourself a great leader, right? Like the unit determines whether or not you're a good leader. And so I brought that perspective. So that has really manifested itself in things like for Athena's training content, for example. It should be like really sort of consumer grade. Like it should look and feel like something that you might just happen to scroll by in the New York Times or any of your favorite streaming apps or something like that. Why? Because of signaling. Like otherwise you're signaling that this isn't important. My co-founder is a software engineer. And so her perspective, which I think has been like to me the most eye-opening part of being in compliance, it's going to sound like glib, but is that stuff should work. Like the software should work like really well. And I have been just like blown away working with, especially some of our larger clients, so multinational, tens of thousands of employees everywhere, and they are struggling with CSVs from their like clunky software that they can't even figure out. Did Joe in California get the right training? And so I think we have this wonderful advisor we work with, Hema, you may know her, and she talks a lot about something like when ideals meet like operational realities. And what we try to do is take the operational realities like off the table, like meaning we sort of solve those for our clients with good tech so that they actually can be aspirational. Like you can't be aspirational if you can't even figure out if your like LMS works and if your hotline is passing some sort of basic audit. So we try to really streamline a lot of that because I'm just noticing that compliance professionals, even if they want to do that next level, real focus on outputs, adaptive learning, those sorts of things. If you're just struggling in the day to day, you can't.
So, Susan, before we got on the pod, we were in the green room, I would say. We were talking about the AI component of this. Could you maybe introduce that topic for this podcast? And maybe we could take a little bit of a deep dive into what you guys see around the role of compliance in AI.
Sure, Tom. Well, what I thought was so extraordinary about the very detailed guidance that's given on AI in this latest iteration of the guidance is how specific it was. And it brought to mind the March 2023 guidance. I mean, I'm in my inner wonk here, so you'll have to forgive me. But in
Love it.
that March 2023 guidance, it talked about for the first time in great depth, the use of employee-owned devices at work. And it basically went into great detail, the same way the AI section goes into great detail. And what DOJ is doing there, and I think it's really a departure from what they had done in the past, which was more to focus on what policies should look like and what code of conducts should focus on, is they're saying you really have to do this and you have to take into account how we're telling you to do it or else. And lo and behold, since that March guidance, there's been 4 billion in fines by my rough reckoning and over 100 name brand companies prosecuted for not having good policies and practices in the area of bring your own device to work. And why that's, of course, is because you have to have auditable records from the Department of Justice point of view, particularly in the financial area, but it applies to all companies, not just financial, which is something that a lot of the commentary hasn't really said. So getting back to AI just briefly, it's clear by putting it in the sort of E&C Bible, if you will, that the DOJ is expecting compliance departments to have eyes, ears, and hands on AI and how it's handled. Um, and there's a great quote from Deputy Assistant General Lisa Monaco, where she said fairly recently that if you don't do that and using AI makes a violation worse, you can expect higher penalties. I mean, she phrased it a little more elegantly than I am, but that was the bottom line. So I think it's something that people really have to focus on.
So let me ask you this around a little bit different focus of the compliance professional, and that is in let's just completely geek out here. In the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, for the first time, the DOJ said that the chief compliance officer and the compliance function were the purveyors and holders of institutional justice and institutional fairness in an organization. And moving forward, I have been intrigued about that overlay on the requirements around AI because a couple of the questions to me in the AI section seem to deal with how are you validating the information or output you're getting from generative AI? And basically, are your inputs non discriminatory and fair within your organization? Do you think that it's reasonable now for the compliance professional to be tasked with that?
In my view, Tom, the compliance professional has always been tasked with that because we both know that one of the key foundational planks of an effective compliance program is organizational justice and fairness. My friend John Drimmer at Paul Hastings argues always, and he's right, that if you don't have that, you just don't have a compliance program. And that's another manifestation of the fact that DOJ recognizes that. And they actually, I think, take that even a step further. I was just looking at the data section, and basically, the compliance officer is entitled under the guidance to equal access to all the data that the business is using. So that really does, not only in theory, but in practice, that the compliance officer has to play an absolutely key role in the way the business is being conducted, even and black boxes are no excuse. That's even in the guidance, I think. It's just come out.
Roxanne, let me kind of base this next question on your prior professional career. And it's the following. Exactly what Susan said about the compliance function shall have access, not should, but shall have access to all data and should use that data in with a tool or with a technological solution to help manage the compliance risk in an organization. And I thought two things about that. Number one, this was a requirement now for the compliance professional, but also I wondered, is it information that a compliance professional can take to senior management to say, this is the expectation and this is what the Department of Justice wants, not from me, but from us. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, how would you counsel a compliance officer to take that information to senior management to increase resources, to increase headcount, to increase budget?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the kind of quotes that jumped out at me in the guidance was like resourced or something, which it makes complete sense because if you are not adequately resourced, like how could you possibly run your program effectively? It's really difficult. And candidly, I've definitely seen a lot of teams struggle with that in the past couple of years, and depending on the sector, the sort of economy, and kind of making that case to just making that budget case to senior leaders that like, I think what's really difficult is a bad compliance program is very cost effective in some ways. Like you just get on Zoom and tell everyone not to do bad stuff and go on with your day. And then Susan points to, for example, these massive fines. And that's totally, true. But I've definitely seen that it can sometimes be hard to make that point in the exact same way that it can be difficult to, in like medicine or fitness, have people be proactive versus reactive. Like we all know the data and yet we don't always eat our vegetables. And so I see compliance leaders really sometimes struggle to make the data, make the case to senior leadership to be adequately resourced. And some of the ways that I've seen them make that case more effectively is not necessarily tie it to, and in some future incident, we could have some big regulatory action, whatever. It can actually be tying it more to culture, to something that a leader does notice every day. So I think terms like compliance kind of feel like in some ways abstract to more, this is my CEO hat on, to like a CEO or COO or something like that. But terms like culture are more every day. And so, for example, when I sometimes see like a hotline, getting a really effective hotline pitched to senior leadership as a compliance tool, it can kind of fall on deaf ears. Like, oh, we're supposed to have it because of Sarbanes-Oxley. Like, okay, fine. I don't know. Roll out a fact sheet and be done with it. But if the compliance official is sort of pitching it as, hey, you see all of these different issues we grappled with over the past 6 months. We noticed that 7 different junior people saw an issue over here, but they weren't comfortable speaking up. And then in this part of the org, we had definite like early indications of a problem, but it was impossible for senior leadership to have visibility into it. And because this person got moved around a bunch of times, we didn't know it until it was too late. If we had a tool that was more about like encouraging a speak up culture, I think we would really be able to be more effective, have higher morale or something like that. It's interestingly almost like making a non-compliance pitch as the business case. I've actually seen be more successful than trotting out DOJ guidance, which to, again, having my CEO hat on, can feel a little bit like abstract, especially if you're in an industry that isn't heavily regulated. It just sort of feels like a bit more of a low likelihood problem, whereas culture is a thing you see every day. You see it in your Glassdoor reviews, that sort of
Susan, I read this update as innovative with the data and with the AI and requiring compliance professionals to utilize data analytics, utilize technology, and begin to think about utilizing AI. Yet, in the same month this was released, we had an enforcement action that was around gifts, travel, and entertainment as basic a FCPA or compliance component as there can be. And that was the John Deere enforcement action. How do we reconcile what you and I might call, if not low hanging fruit on the ground, and we shouldn't be worried about anymore, with here a major US company that everyone knows because of its name for 200 years gets caught up in a gifts, travel, and entertainment FCPA enforcement action? Is somebody just not getting the memo, or how do we reconcile this guidance with as basic a violation as we can have?
I share your frustration because at this stage in the compliance and ethics journey, it shouldn't happen. But I think it does get back. I've never worked with Deere, even though they were a client of my prior employer, but I have bought their products. But at any rate, if you have a culture that says this is how we do it, and if you, yeah, I remember it used to drive me crazy when I was in house that I'd go to different places around the world and they'd say, you don't understand how business is done here. And I felt like saying, you don't understand how business is done by us. And you may want to find someplace else to work if that's not okay. because that's not an excuse. But in the end, whether rules get followed is dependent on the culture. They're not self executing. And so you have to have supervisors who have the knowledge and have the training that sensitizes them to the fact that, I don't know, whether it was handing out Rolex watches or whatever, it, it never really seems to change in that regard. But you have to have leaders at every level who can say, that's not something we do. We're not going to authorize that. Or if the expense report has been falsified, you have to have auditors who are going to catch things like that. And my old company, AECOM, has done a very good job of building its own in-house analytics, thanks to the former head of audit, that can catch things like that when they're starting to happen. And as Roxanne said, that's what you want to do. You want to get at problems before they become big problems. And if you do, that strengthens the culture, as well as being vigilant and just saying, we have zero tolerance for this.
And if I could just jump in real quick, like one thought I have, Tom, I think it's a super fair question, but just because the compliance field has been around for a long time, and I'm sure that John Deere had a very elaborate policy around gifts, travel, entertainment, et cetera, but you still have new employees joining every day. And you still have new managers who get promoted. And one day they were just going about their business, and now they're in this position of power. And so I think what can be tricky from understandably a deep compliance wealth of experience is sort of feeling like, haven't we talked about this a million times? But to the employee, they're joining an organization. They might hear, don't worry about it. This is how we do things. And be like, oh, okay. I don't know. And I think we just kind of forget the immense power that local managers have over their small teams. And so even if quote headquarters is disseminating correct information and they've got great policies or whatever, if the managers either aren't getting that memo, don't have supervision, aren't sort of part of this process, like it may as well be like there's just no possible way that the employee is getting that information. And so I don't know, I think about this being really like a continual conversation versus hey, didn't you read the memo?
Roxanne, I'd like to end by asking you about leadership and how would you counsel a CCO? And actually, you started this in your prior answer about perhaps staying away from the compliance word and talk about
Mhm.
risk or risk management or operation. How would you help a compliance professional think through how can I go to senior management and not persuade them that I need resources or budget, but really have them understand they are a part of compliance and they have a role to play and they have a message to give. How would you help a compliance professional think through that?
Yeah, I think that the trick to persuasion in my experience is sort of figuring out what your boss cares about and then framing what you want in terms of what your boss cares about. And that sounds very craven and Machiavellian or something, but I think it's at the end of the day not, because with you're reporting to the CEO, like they care about a lot of things. Using words like compliance and risk assessment is just not speaking their sort of native tongue in my experience. Talking about things like culture, reputation. Like I think a leader cares so much about the reputation of their business and how it's perceived by employees, by shareholders. And so just it sounds like just putting window dressing on it, but I think it can really change the conversation to talk about things in terms of pride in our organization, pride in our culture, kind of like carrying on a legacy, like those sorts of things, and less about something like compliance, risk assessment, these terms that of course are very important and mean a lot to a professional, but to a leader, to a CEO, someone who's not in the compliance space, may seem a little bit more. These are impediments to the business, and when you frame them as they're not impediments to the business, they're actually kind of a guardian of the like business and the business culture and reputation. I think it just like totally reframes the conversation.
Well, ladies, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you both if any of our listeners wanted to connect with either of you guys, what might be the best way to do so? And if they wanted more information on Athenian, what would be the best place for them to go? So, Roxanne, once again, I'll start with you.
Sure. Best place to find me is on LinkedIn because there are not many Roxanne Petraeuses in the world. There are a lot of vowels in that last name. And then if they would like to find out more about Athena, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or our website is goathena, ETHENA.com.
And Susan,
I'm 100% in with Athena. Just reach out to Athena. I do LinkedIn too, but I'm there.
Ladies, this has been great. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Sounds good.